There are moments in life when absence speaks louder than any accusation ever could. When you are suddenly removed from a place, a relationship, or a circle where you once poured your patience, your kindness, and your endurance, it feels at first like punishment. The heart asks why goodness is the one asked to leave, while cruelty remains seated. Yet there is a deeper logic at work, one that is not born of revenge but of revelation. Sometimes God does not correct people with words. Sometimes he corrects them with silence. And sometimes he corrects them by removing the very person who absorbed the weight of their actions. You were not taken away because you were weak. You were taken away because your presence was cushioning them from the consequences of who they were becoming. As long as you stayed, their sharpness had a soft place to land. Their neglect had a patient witness. Their selfishness met no resistance, because you kept translating pain into understanding. You made their behavior survivable for them. And so, quietly and without spectacle, God stepped in and said, "Enough." There is a peculiar mercy in removal. It is the moment when a person is finally left alone with the echo of their own choices. When you were there, their words fell on your chest and stopped. Now those same words circle back in an empty room. When you were there, their indifference still had someone to ignore. Now indifference has no audience, and it begins to feel like loneliness. This is not cruelty from God. It is clarity. People often believe that consequences must arrive as sudden disasters, public shame, or visible collapse, but more often consequences arrive as awareness, a slow, unwelcome understanding, a realization that something precious is missing and cannot be summoned back by apology alone. God allows people to feel what they once caused when he removes the shield that stood between them and themselves. You were that shield, though you never meant to be. It is important to understand that this removal was not about teaching them through your suffering. God does not require innocent people to stay in harm's way to prove a lesson. He removes the innocent so that the guilty may finally encounter truth without distortion. While you were present, they could believe their actions had no cost. Your endurance made their behavior look harmless. Your forgiveness made their wrongdoing seem small, and so God in his strange kindness withdrew you. Now they feel it, not necessarily as guilt at first, but as discomfort, as restlessness, as the unsettling sense that something is wrong, though they cannot name it. They may call it bad luck, they may call it emptiness, they may blame circumstances, but deep down something in them recognizes the shape of what is missing. It is the shape of the patience they exhausted, the loyalty they took for granted, the presence they assumed would always remain. You meanwhile may wonder why you were not defended more loudly, why justice did not arrive with thunder. But quiet justice is often the most accurate kind. God did not argue on your behalf. He moved you out of harm's reach. He did not force them to understand. He allowed them to experience. An experience is a teacher that cannot be debated with. There is also another truth hidden in this removal, one that concerns you more than them. When God removes you, he is not only exposing their actions, he is rescuing your perception. Prolonged mistreatment has a way of shrinking a person's sense of what is normal. Pain endured too long begins to feel deserved. God removes you so that you can breathe again without bracing for impact, so that you can rediscover that love is not meant to feel like survival. If they are honest, they will eventually see that losing you was not the loss of comfort, but the loss of conscience. You reminded them, simply by being who you were, that kindness exists. Without you, they face the barren landscape of their own making. Whether they learn from it is their responsibility. That lesson is no longer yours to carry. And if you ever feel tempted to return out of pity, remember this: God did not remove you to punish them and then send you back to absorb the aftershock. He removed you so the lesson could stand on its own. Your role was never to be the consequence. Your role was to be faithful. The consequence belongs to truth, and truth does not need your suffering to speak. So, if you feel strange peace mixed with lingering sorrow, do not mistake it for confusion. It is the sign that something unhealthy has been interrupted. God removed you not because you were expendable, but because you were invaluable, and they could only understand that by feeling, at last, what they once made you feel. Justice does not always arrive with raised voices, dramatic exposure, or visible punishment. Often God chooses a quieter method, one that bypasses argument and goes straight to the heart. Removal is one of his most precise tools. When God removes a person from a situation, it is not an act of abandonment, but an act of truth. Absence has a way of revealing what presence was silently absorbing. What confrontation could not correct, distance begins to clarify. Many people assume that justice must look like vindication. They imagine God stepping in to explain, accuse, or defend. Yet explanation rarely transforms a hardened heart. Words can be dismissed, twisted, or forgotten. Removal cannot. When someone who once carried the emotional weight, the patience, the understanding, and the sacrifice is no longer present, the environment changes immediately. The space grows colder, the silence grows heavier. Suddenly, actions echo instead of disappearing. God understands human nature better than humans understand themselves. He knows that some people only comprehend pain when they are forced to sit with its absence. While you were present, their behavior had somewhere to land. Their harshness met tolerance. Their neglect met endurance. Their selfishness met accommodation. They could live comfortably inside their flaws because you made room for them. Justice in that context would have been impossible without harming you further. So God chose removal. Removal does not argue facts, it reveals them. Once you are gone, the excuses stop working, the narrative collapses. The person who believed they were justified now has no one left to blame. The comfort they mistook for strength disappears, and they are left with themselves. That encounter can be deeply unsettling. It forces reflection where denial once lived. God allows that discomfort, not to destroy them, but to awaken them. This kind of justice is unsettling because it feels unfinished. You may wait for an apology that never comes, or acknowledgement that remains unspoken. Yet justice is not measured by visible regret. It is measured by internal reckoning. God's work often happens in places you will never see. Quiet thoughts, sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and the slow realization that something essential is missing. Removal plants those seeds. What makes this form of justice so powerful is that it does not require you to suffer any longer. God does not demand that the wounded stay in place to prove a point. He removes the innocent from harm and lets truth do the rest. This is not weakness, it is moral precision. Justice that destroys both parties is not justice at all. God's justice separates the roles. One is freed, the other is confronted. People often misunderstand this separation and assume it means the story is over. In reality, it is only beginning, just not for you. For you, removal is protection and restoration. For them, it is exposure. The absence of your kindness reveals the weight of their behavior. The absence of your presence reveals the cost of their choices. God does not need to accuse them. Their own experience becomes the accusation. This is why removal feels both painful and peaceful. Painful because loss always carries grief, even when it is necessary. Peaceful because something unnatural has ended. God rarely explains removal in advance. Explanation would soften its impact. Justice requires clarity, and clarity often comes only after separation. Once removed, patterns become visible. The truth, once obscured by emotion, stands unobstructed. Justice through removal also protects your heart from bitterness. If God were to publicly shame or punish, you might feel temporary satisfaction but long-term corrosion. Removal allows you to heal without becoming hardened. It allows justice to occur without recruiting you into vengeance. God handles the weight while you are invited to recover your sense of self. Some people will never admit what they lost. Pride may keep their mouths closed, but silence does not mean ignorance. The human heart knows when it has crossed a line, even if the mind refuses to confess it. Removal presses on that knowledge daily. Every absence becomes a reminder. Every moment where you should have been but are not becomes a quiet verdict. Justice, in its truest form, restores order. God removes you so order can return, within you and within them, not through force, but through truth experienced. And truth, once felt, is far more powerful than truth merely spoken. Your presence was doing more than you ever realized. It was acting as a buffer between people and the consequences of their own behavior. While you believed you were simply being patient, understanding, or loving, you were actually absorbing the impact of actions that should have rebounded back to their source. You stood in the space where discomfort should have lived. You softened moments that were meant to sting, and because of that, the truth of what they were doing never fully reached them. Human beings learn not only by intention but by consequence. When consequences are delayed or dulled, behavior rarely changes. As long as you remained, their words could be careless without cost, their absence could be excused, their disrespect could be minimized. You translated their wrongs into explanations, telling yourself stories that made it easier to endure. In doing so, you unknowingly protected them from themselves. You became the cushion that kept their conscience from waking up. God saw what you were carrying. He saw how often you chose peace over protest, silence over confrontation, endurance over escape. He also saw how that endurance was enabling harm to continue unchecked. Justice could not reach them while you stood in the way, not because you were wrong, but because your goodness was being misused. So God did what love sometimes must do. He removed the shield. Once you were gone, nothing stood between them and the weight of their own actions. No one softened the atmosphere. No one smoothed over the tension. No one explained away the discomfort. Suddenly, the same behavior that once felt harmless began to feel heavy. The same words echoed instead of disappearing. The same silence felt colder. This is not coincidence. It is consequence finally arriving without interference. Many people believe protection always looks like defense. In reality, protection often looks like separation. God protected you by removing you, and in doing so, He stopped protecting them from the truth. They had been living on borrowed mercy, not because God approved of their actions, but because you kept absorbing the cost. That arrangement was unsustainable. Mercy without awareness becomes indulgence. God does not allow indulgence to masquerade as grace forever. This realization can be painful because it reframes your suffering. You begin to see that what hurt you was not only the actions themselves, but the fact that you were carrying burdens that were never meant to be yours. You were paying emotional debts that belonged to someone else. God's removal was a correction of balance. He returned responsibility to its rightful owner. When the shield is taken away, exposure follows. People may not immediately recognize what is happening. They may feel restless, irritated, unsettled. They may blame circumstances or misfortune. Rarely do they say, "This is the cost of what I did," but the heart knows. Something inside them senses the shift. Life no longer feels padded, interactions feel sharper, silence feels louder. The protection is gone. This does not mean they will change. Awareness does not guarantee repentance, but it does guarantee honesty at some level. They can no longer claim ignorance. They can no longer believe their actions had no effect. God does not force growth, but He removes illusions. Your absence dismantles the illusion that they were harmless, justified, or right. For you, this separation is also an education. It teaches you that love is not meant to function as a shield against accountability. Kindness is not supposed to cancel truth. Loyalty is not meant to erase boundaries. God removed you not only so they could feel what they did, but so you could finally stop feeling what was never yours to carry. If guilt whispers that you abandoned them, remember this: God does not abandon people by removing protection. He corrects them. Protection that enables harm is not protection at all. By stepping aside, you allowed God's order to reassert itself. You allowed consequences to teach what words could not. Your role was never to save them from themselves. Your role was to be faithful to what is good. Once that goodness was being used as cover for harm, God intervened. The shield was lifted. Truth stepped forward. And for the first time, they were left to feel, without interruption, what they had been giving all along. Being left alone with oneself is one of the most uncomfortable experiences a human being can face. When God removes a person like you from someone's life, He is not creating emptiness by accident. He is creating a mirror. The silence that follows your absence is not quiet at all. It is filled with memories, realizations, and unanswered questions. Without you present to absorb tension or soften reality, they are forced to encounter the atmosphere they themselves created. While you were there, life had a certain balance for them. Even when they behaved poorly, something still felt stable. Your patience disguised their cruelty. Your loyalty diluted their guilt. Your willingness to stay made their actions feel less severe than they truly were. They could continue as they were because you unknowingly carried the emotional consequences on your own heart. Once you were gone, that balance collapsed. God understands that some lessons cannot be taught through explanation. Words give people room to argue. Silence does not. When you were removed, they lost the distraction that allowed them to avoid reflection. Suddenly evenings felt longer. Conversations felt emptier. Familiar routines felt hollow. The absence of your presence created a space where their thoughts could no longer be outrun. This is where truth begins its quiet work. Left alone, people start noticing patterns they once ignored. They remember moments when they dismissed you, wounded you, or took you for granted. Those moments replay, not because they are being punished, but because memory insists on honesty when comfort is gone. God allows this replay not to torture them, but to confront them. Growth, when it comes at all, begins in discomfort. Isolation has a way of stripping away self-deception. Without someone else to blame, justify, or distract, people begin to sense that something is wrong within. They may not immediately name it as guilt. Often it shows up as irritation, restlessness, or dissatisfaction with everything around them. They might feel misunderstood by others now, suddenly sensitive to the same behaviors they once inflicted. It is not irony, it is awakening. God's removal of you shifts the emotional weight back where it belongs. What you once carried quietly now presses on their own chest. The loneliness they may feel is not caused by your absence alone, but by the realization that they pushed away someone who offered sincerity. The emptiness is not just missing you. It is missing the version of themselves they could have been had they chosen differently. This process is deeply internal. You may never witness it. They may never admit it. Pride often prevents confession, even to oneself. But the heart keeps records, the mind tries to erase. In moments of stillness, those records surface. God uses those moments to teach what presence once prevented them from feeling. Being left alone also removes the illusion of control. When you were there, they believed they could behave however they wished without consequence. Your continued presence reinforced the false belief that relationships endure regardless of treatment. Removal shatters that belief. It introduces a new reality. People can leave, and when they do, they take something irreplaceable with them. This realization can be frightening. It forces them to confront not only what they did to you, but what they might do again if unchanged. Some will respond by hardening themselves further, choosing denial over growth. Others will feel the weight and begin questioning their patterns. God does not decide the outcome for them. He only creates the conditions for truth to appear. Meanwhile, you are no longer trapped in the role of emotional shock absorber. God's removal frees you from being the place where their unresolved issues landed. You are no longer required to translate pain into patience or hurt into hope. The space you once occupied in their life now teaches a lesson you could never teach by staying. This is not abandonment. It is moral exposure. God leaves people alone with themselves, not to destroy them, but to give them the chance to finally see clearly. Whether they accept that clarity or reject it is beyond your responsibility. Your part ended the moment God moved you out of harm's way. What follows for them is a reckoning that happens quietly, honestly, and without witnesses. The absence of your voice becomes the loudest sound they hear. The absence of your presence becomes the truest reflection they face. And in that solitude, they come face to face with the reality of who they were when no one stopped them, and who they might still become if they choose to change. Silence unsettles people far more than confrontation ever could. Arguments allow resistance. Explanations invite debate. Even accusations give the comfort of engagement. Silence offers none of these. When God chooses distance over dialogue, he removes the stage on which defensiveness performs. What remains is a quiet space where truth has no opponent. In that space, learning begins. Words are easily misused. People twist them, reinterpret them, or dismiss them according to their comfort. A spoken boundary can be mocked. A protest can be labeled exaggeration. A plea can be ignored. But silence refuses participation. It does not negotiate. It does not explain itself. It simply exists, and in doing so, it forces others to sit with what they once escaped. When God removes you and replaces your voice with distance, he introduces a teacher that cannot be argued with. Silence does not accuse, yet it implies. It does not demand accountability, yet it exposes the lack of it. Distance does not shout, yet it carries meaning with an almost unbearable weight. People are far more honest with themselves in quiet than they ever are in conversation. While you were present, your voice may have softened reality. You explained intentions, you clarified misunderstandings, you gave the benefit of the doubt. Even when you spoke about hurt, your compassion diluted the impact. Silence removes that dilution. Without your words, they are left with memory. Without your explanations, they are left with interpretation. Without your presence, they are left with consequence. God understands that some truths must be felt, not explained. Distance creates feeling, It creates absence, and absence is not empty. It is filled with questions. Why did they leave? Why does this feel different? Why does the same behavior now feel unbearable? These questions arise not because someone told them to ask, but because silence made avoidance impossible. Distance also removes distraction. When you were there, interactions filled the gaps where reflection might have grown. Conversation, routine, and familiarity kept deeper thoughts at bay. Once distance arrives, the mind has fewer places to hide. Silence stretches time. It slows moments. It allows thoughts to linger instead of rushing past. God uses this slowness to surface what speed once concealed. But this is why silence often feels harsher than anger. Anger still implies attachment. Silence suggests finality, not always permanent, but definite enough to cause pause. People begin replaying moments they once ignored. Words they dismissed return with clarity. Gestures they overlooked gain significance. Distance sharpens memory. God does not need to remind them. Silence does the remembering for him. Distance also shifts power. While you were present, power often belonged to the one who spoke louder, withdrew affection, or controlled the emotional climate. Silence removes that leverage. No reaction means no control. No response means no manipulation. God uses distance to dismantle unhealthy dynamics without confrontation. What arguments failed to change, absence begins to unravel. This teaching is deeply uncomfortable because it requires personal responsibility. Silence does not tell someone what to think. It forces them to think. Distance does not explain what went wrong. It invites examination. God allows this discomfort because growth that comes without discomfort rarely lasts. A lesson learned through silence settles deeper than one learned through correction. You may never witness the results of this teaching. Distance does not perform for an audience. Its work is private, unfolding in moments of solitude, regret, or realization. Some will resist it. Some will numb themselves. Others will finally understand what words could not convey. God does not guarantee repentance. He guarantees opportunity for truth. Meanwhile, silence protects you. It spares you the exhaustion of repeating yourself to someone determined not to hear. Distance guards your heart from further erosion. God removes you from the cycle not because you failed to communicate, but because communication was no longer the lesson required. Silence and distance are not signs that nothing is happening. They are signs that something deeper is underway. God steps back, removes noise, and lets reality speak for itself. And reality, when left uninterrupted, has a way of teaching what no voice ever could. God's concern is never satisfied by lessons that demand innocent suffering as their currency. He does not balance the moral universe by asking the wounded to remain wounded so that the wrongdoer might learn something useful. That idea flatters cruelty by pretending it has educational value. When harm continues under the banner of patience, it ceases to be virtue and becomes quiet permission. God intervenes not by applauding endurance that destroys the soul, but by removing the one who is being consumed by it. Staying too long in harm reshapes the heart in dangerous ways. What begins as mercy slowly mutates into self-erasure. Boundaries blur, pain becomes normal. The mind adapts to injustice, the way the body adapts to cold, by numbing itself. God does not call that holiness. He calls it a distortion of love. Love that requires your disappearance is not love at all. So when God removes the innocent, he is not abandoning the guilty. He is refusing to sanctify damage. Many confuse endurance with righteousness, as though suffering patiently were proof of moral superiority. Yet patience without truth is merely delay. It postpones reckoning and mislabels stagnation as peace. God's justice does not grow by keeping the gentle trapped in cycles of harm. Justice grows when truth is allowed to reach its destination without obstruction. Removing the innocent clears the path for that truth. Harm persists most easily when it is cushioned. As long as someone absorbs the blow, the one striking can pretend the impact was light. Your presence softened what should have felt sharp. Your forgiveness diluted what should have tasted bitter. God does not correct that by asking you to harden yourself. He corrects it by lifting you out. In doing so, He restores moral gravity to the situation. Actions regain their proper weight. This removal also protects the integrity of justice itself. Justice that requires collateral damage is not justice. It is chaos with better branding. God does not educate one soul by sacrificing another. He does not trade your peace for their growth. When He removes you, He separates learning from injury. They may still learn. You are no longer required to bleed for it. Protection is often mistaken for intervention. People imagine God stepping in with immediate correction, dramatic exposure, or visible punishment. But protection frequently arrives as exit. It arrives as a closed door, a broken attachment, an ending that feels abrupt but is precisely timed. God protects the innocent by interrupting the pattern, not by explaining it away. Remaining in harm also warps perception. The longer one stays, the more one doubts their own reality. Pain becomes negotiable. Disrespect becomes debatable. The heart begins to ask not whether something is wrong, but whether it is wrong enough to leave. God does not allow that erosion to continue indefinitely. Removal restores clarity. Distance returns proportion. What felt confusing in closeness becomes obvious in separation. For the one who caused harm, this removal changes the conditions under which understanding is possible. Learning that depends on someone else's tolerance is fragile and false. It collapses the moment tolerance ends. God prefers lessons that stand on their own, lessons taught by experience rather than accommodation. When the innocent is removed, the lesson no longer feeds on their patience. It confronts the wrongdoer directly. This does not mean compassion disappears. God's compassion remains intact, but it is no longer expressed through your endurance. Compassion can be firm. Mercy can be structured. Grace can set limits. God's mercy toward the guilty does not require your continued exposure to injury. By removing you, He preserves both mercy and justice without forcing them to compete. Guilt often whispers that leaving is a failure of love. That whisper misunderstands love's purpose. Love seeks good, not proximity at any cost. Love that enables harm is not faithful, it is confused. God corrects that confusion decisively. He removes the innocent so love can regain its shape, protective, truthful, and free. In this separation, roles are clarified. You are no longer the shield. You are no longer the buffer. You are no longer the translator of pain into palatable stories. God assumes responsibility for what follows. The lesson, the reckoning, the awareness, these are His domain now. Your domain is healing, restoration, and the rediscovery of peace that does not require you to disappear in order to exist. Consequences are rarely delivered in the dramatic ways people expect. Most imagine justice as something loud, public, and unmistakable, a collapse that can be pointed to, named, and judged from a distance. Yet God often chooses a quieter path, one that penetrates deeper than spectacle ever could. He allows consequences to arrive as awareness, as a hollow feeling, as a discomfort that cannot be explained away. This form of consequence does not announce itself, but it settles in and refuses to leave. Awareness is unsettling because it removes excuses. When something goes wrong outwardly, people can blame timing, circumstances, or other people. When something goes wrong inwardly, there is nowhere to hide. God allows this internal shift because it reaches places punishment never could. Emptiness does not accuse, but it interrogates. Discomfort does not shout, but it persists. It follows people into quiet moments and presses questions they would rather not answer. While you were present, consequences were softened. Any discomfort that might have awakened them was interrupted by your patience, your understanding, your willingness to stay. Awareness had no room to grow because reassurance filled the gaps. God removes that reassurance so feeling can return. Not dramatic suffering, but subtle imbalance. Life continues, yet something feels off. Conversations lack warmth. Success feels muted. Rest does not restore. This is consequence unfolding gently, relentlessly. Emptiness is one of the most honest teachers God uses. It does not tell people what they did wrong. It invites them to ask why fulfillment has vanished. People often mistake emptiness for boredom or dissatisfaction with life in general. Yet beneath that restlessness is a deeper recognition that something meaningful has been lost. Not an object, not a routine, but a presence that once brought emotional stability. God allows emptiness to surface so truth can breathe. Discomfort follows close behind. The same behaviors that once felt normal begin to feel irritating when mirrored back by others. The same coldness they practiced feels unbearable when experienced. The same distance they enforced now feels like rejection. This is not irony for entertainment's sake. It is empathy forming slowly, painfully, without explanation. God permits this discomfort because it teaches through experience rather than instruction. What makes this form of consequence so effective is its ambiguity. People cannot easily identify it as punishment. It does not come with a label. That ambiguity prevents defensiveness. If God were to punish openly, pride would rise in protest. Awareness bypasses pride. It seeps in quietly and rearranges perception from the inside. People begin noticing patterns they once denied. They sense loss without being told what was lost. This awareness does not always lead to repentance. Some will numb it, some will distract themselves, some will harden their hearts and declare that nothing is wrong, but even resistance is a form of engagement. Something has been felt. Something has been disturbed. God does not force response. He ensures encounter. The encounter happens in the private spaces where honesty is hardest to avoid. For you, this is why justice may seem invisible. You may look for evidence of consequence and find none. They may appear fine. Life may move forward for them, yet internal consequence does not advertise itself. Awareness works beneath appearances. Emptiness does not post updates. Discomfort does not announce milestones. God's work here is not for your validation. It is for truth's completion. It is for truth's completion. This process also preserves your freedom. If consequences came through visible collapse, you might be tempted to watch, wait, or measure. Awareness removes that temptation. You are released from observation. God handles what unfolds in places you no longer occupy. Justice continues without your involvement, which is precisely the point. Consequences that arrive as awareness also mature slowly. Sudden punishment shocks but fades. Lingering discomfort reshapes. Emptiness that remains unresolved demands reflection. God prefers transformation over reaction. He allows consequences to linger just long enough to invite understanding, but not so violently that growth becomes impossible. What they feel now is not what you felt then. Your pain was immediate and personal. Their consequence is delayed and internal. Different in form, equal in weight. God does not mirror suffering exactly. He mirrors truth. And truth, once felt, changes how a person sees themselves, their past, and the absence they can no longer explain away. You were removed so this awareness could exist. Your absence made room for emptiness. Your silence made room for discomfort. God did not need to punish loudly. He only needed to remove what was masking reality. From that moment on, consequence began its quiet work, unseen, unannounced, and impossible to escape. Forgiveness, when misunderstood, can become a hiding place for harm. What you offered freely was meant to heal, not to excuse. Yet over time, your willingness to forgive without conditions slowly blurred the line between grace and permission. Each time you chose understanding over confrontation, each time you absorbed pain and chose silence, something subtle happened. Harmful behavior began to feel normal, not to you, but to them. Endurance has a dangerous side when it stands alone. It can unintentionally teach people that their actions carry no real weight. When someone wounds another and nothing appears to change, the mind quietly concludes that the wound must not have been serious. Your strength became their evidence. Your calm became their justification. Your continued presence suggested that what they were doing could not be that wrong, otherwise you would not still be there. In this way, forgiveness, meant to soften hearts, ended up dulling conscience. God sees when forgiveness is being misused. He knows the difference between mercy that heals and mercy that hides truth. Your forgiveness was sincere, but it was being interpreted as approval. Each time you stayed, each time you explained away behavior, each time you chose peace over truth, the message received was not, "I am hurting," but "this is acceptable." Over time, harm grows bolder when it believes it has been sanctioned. This is why God intervenes, not to punish forgiveness, but to protect its meaning. Forgiveness was never meant to erase accountability. It was never meant to silence truth. It was never meant to train someone to feel entitled to another person's pain. When God removed you, He restored the balance forgiveness had lost. Without you there to cushion the impact, behavior regained its proper weight. What once seemed small suddenly felt heavy. Words that were once dismissed now echoed. Silence that was once comfortable now felt cold. Distance replaced familiarity, and with it came a realization they could no longer avoid. Forgiveness had not meant harmlessness, it had meant patience. And patience, when exhausted, leaves behind clarity. God does not shame people for accepting forgiveness. He corrects them for abusing it. When forgiveness becomes a shield against responsibility, it must be withdrawn, not revoked, but separated from proximity. God did not turn your forgiveness into bitterness, He turned it into distance. That distance allowed truth to surface without contaminating your heart. For you, this separation is sobering. It forces you to confront how often you minimized your own pain in the name of being good, how frequently you doubted your right to be affected, how often you confused tolerance with love. God's removal interrupts that pattern. It teaches you that forgiveness does not require continued access. You can forgive and still leave. You can release resentment without remaining available to harm. For them, the loss of your forgiveness, as presence, creates discomfort. They are no longer shielded by your understanding. They are no longer insulated by your patience. The absence of your grace makes their behavior visible, not to others, but to themselves. This visibility is unsettling. It removes the comfort of believing they were justified all along. God allows this discomfort because growth cannot occur where harm is continually softened. Forgiveness that erases consequence teaches nothing. Forgiveness that exists alongside boundaries teaches everything. By removing you, God redefined forgiveness not as endless endurance, but as truth without resentment. This does not guarantee repentance. Some will resent the boundary, some will reinterpret the story to preserve their self-image, but even resistance carries awareness. Something has changed. The environment no longer confirms their narrative. The forgiveness they relied on is no longer accessible in the same way, and that loss forces reflection, whether they welcome it or not. Your forgiveness did not fail. It was simply completed. God took it out of a context where it was being exploited and placed it in one where it no longer costs you your peace. Harmful behavior no longer hides behind your goodness. Accountability returns. Truth stands unobstructed. By stepping away, you did not become unforgiving. You became whole. God ensured that forgiveness could remain pure by removing it from a place where it was being used to justify what should have been corrected. And in that separation, both mercy and truth were finally allowed to exist without cancelling each other out. Removal carries two purposes at once, even though it often feels like only one at the beginning. On the surface, it looks like loss, separation, or failure. Beneath that surface, something more deliberate is happening. What unfolds for them is exposure, but what unfolds for you is rescue. God never removes the innocent solely to correct the guilty. He removes the innocent because the innocent have been carrying what was never theirs to hold. While you were present, your emotional world revolved around containment. You contained tension. You contained disappointment. You contained confusion. You learned to measure your words, manage your reactions, and minimize your needs so peace could survive. That constant self-exargement slowly reshaped your inner life. You became vigilant instead of relaxed, careful instead of free. Over time, this feels like maturity, but it is actually self-abandonment, disguised as strength. God sees when endurance starts eroding identity. He sees when kindness turns into quiet disappearance. Restoration cannot occur in an environment that requires you to stay diminished. So removal becomes an act of mercy toward you. It interrupts the slow loss of self before it becomes permanent. God does not wait until you are empty to rescue you. He intervenes while there is still something whole to protect. For them, this same act feels very different. What restores you exposes them. The space you once filled now reveals what they avoided. Your absence highlights habits, attitudes, and patterns that went unnoticed when someone else was compensating for them. Exposure does not always look like shame. Often it looks like inconvenience, emotional discomfort, or relational instability. The structure they relied on quietly collapses because its support has been removed. What is crucial to understand is that these two outcomes, your restoration and their exposure, are not competing interests. They are aligned. God does not heal you at their expense. He heals you by restoring order. You were never meant to function as the stabilizer of someone else's disorder. When God removes you, He returns each person to their rightful responsibility. Restoration for you begins subtly. It often starts as relief, mixed with guilt. Relief because the pressure is gone. Guilt because you were trained to believe leaving equates to failure. God gently dismantles that lie. He reminds you not with words but with experience what peace feels like when it is not negotiated. You begin to notice how your body relaxes, how your thoughts slow, how your voice returns to its natural tone instead of constant restraint. As this restoration unfolds, clarity follows. Patterns that once felt confusing suddenly appear obvious. You see how often you apologized for things that were not wrong, how frequently you doubted your perception. Distance sharpens vision. God uses this clarity to rebuild your sense of worth, not through affirmation alone, but through contrast. You begin to recognize what healthy connection feels like, precisely because you are no longer surviving an unhealthy one. Meanwhile, exposure works quietly for them. Without you buffering reality, life feels less forgiving. Reactions from others feel harsher. Relationships feel more fragile. The same behaviors that were tolerated before now provoke resistance. This shift is disorienting. It creates questions they did not previously have to ask. God allows this not to humiliate them, but to confront them with consistency. The world begins responding to them without your mediation. This dual process reveals something important. You were never the problem that needed fixing. You were the solution that had been overused. God restores you by removing you from misuse. Exposure occurs because the misuse can no longer be hidden. In this way, removal is both corrective and protective. Restoration also returns choice to you. While you were there, your decisions were constrained by the need to maintain balance. Leaving restores agency. You can decide how close to be, what to tolerate, what to protect. God reintroduces you to yourself as someone who has options, not obligations. That shift is deeply healing. Exposure, on the other hand, removes shortcuts for them. They can no longer rely on your patience to soften outcomes. They must interact with the world as they are, not as you made it easier for them to be. God does not rush this process. Exposure unfolds gradually through repeated encounters with resistance, disappointment, or reflection. What makes this moment sacred is that both processes unfold without requiring your involvement. You are not asked to confront, explain, or justify. God handles the exposure. You are invited into restoration. The separation of roles is intentional. It prevents further harm and prevents your healing from being entangled with their awakening. Removal, then, is not an ending. It is a realignment. You are placed back in the care of God instead of the management of someone else's behavior. They are placed back in contact with the consequences of their own patterns. Restoration rises where exhaustion once lived. Exposure settles where comfort once hid. Both are acts of divine order. Both are necessary, and neither requires you to sacrifice yourself any longer to make truth visible. Responsibility has a way of becoming distorted when one person carries more than their share. Over time, you were slowly assigned a task you never agreed to, managing the emotional consequences of someone else's choices. You absorbed tension so conflict could be avoided. You swallowed hurt so peace could appear intact. You carried the weight of keeping things functional while they moved freely, untouched by the impact of their behavior. God never intended that burden to rest on you. When God removes you, He is not abandoning unfinished business. He is redistributing responsibility back to its rightful place. The lesson that must be learned does not belong to you. It belongs to the one who caused the damage. By stepping away, you are not refusing growth. You are refusing to carry what was never yours to carry. God takes over what you were never meant to manage. There is a subtle kind of guilt that arises when you realize this. It whispers that if you had stayed longer, explained better, forgiven more, things might have changed. That guilt misunderstands how growth works. People do not change because someone suffers enough on their behalf. They change when they are allowed to feel the full weight of their actions without interruption. God removes you so that learning, if it is to happen, can finally occur in the proper place. Your departure does something important. It ends emotional substitution. You are no longer paying the price for someone else's behavior. You are no longer translating their harm into silence or patience. The moment you leave, the lesson becomes direct. Whatever discomfort arises now belongs to its source. God does not require you to witness it, supervise it, or measure it. Your role is complete. This release is essential for healing. As long as you believed the lesson depended on you, your nervous system stayed alert, waiting for resolution. Distance breaks that cycle. It tells your body that vigilance is no longer necessary. You are not responsible for outcomes you do not control. God restores peace by removing false responsibility, not by asking you to tolerate more. For them, this transfer of responsibility is disorienting. They may feel unfairly treated, misunderstood, or abandoned. These reactions are not signs that you did something wrong. They are signs that accountability has arrived without a buffer. When someone loses the person who absorbed their impact, the rawness of their own behavior becomes impossible to ignore. God allows this not to punish, but to clarify. The important truth here is that their lesson does not require your pain to continue. Whatever awareness they reach now comes through their own experience, not your endurance. This is how God preserves justice without perpetuating harm. He removes the intermediary. You were never meant to be the classroom where their growth took place. Letting go of responsibility also frees your future. When you stop carrying someone else's lesson, you regain energy for your own life. Attention returns inward. Choices expand. You are no longer anchored to an outcome you cannot control. God opens space not just for healing, but for renewal, for relationships that do not require self-erasure, for environments where peace does not have to be defended. Some lessons unfold slowly. Some may never fully land. That is not a failure on your part. Growth is offered, not forced. God does not measure success by repentance alone, but by the restoration of order. Order is restored when each person carries what belongs to them, and no more. By stepping away, you honored that order. You did not abandon the lesson, you returned it to its rightful owner. God handles what follows with wisdom you cannot see, and fairness you do not need to oversee. Your task now is simpler and far more sacred, to live unburdened by a responsibility that was never yours, and to trust that whatever they must feel, learn, or confront is being held by God, not by you. What has happened was never random, and it was never cruel. God did not remove you to erase your value, but to reveal it. He did not separate you to create loss, but to restore order. Your absence was not a punishment, it was a correction, a quiet, deliberate act of justice that protected your heart while allowing truth to stand where comfort once hid. You were not taken away because you failed to love enough. You were taken away because love had begun to cost you your peace, your clarity, and your sense of self. God does not demand that goodness be proven through suffering. He intervenes when endurance becomes erosion. In removing you, He ended a pattern that required your silence so others could remain unchanged. What they feel now is no longer yours to manage. The emptiness, the discomfort, the awareness, these are not debts you owe or lessons you must supervise. God has reclaimed that responsibility. Your role was never to be the consequence. Your role was to be faithful, and that faithfulness has already done its work. Now begins a different season, one where peace is not negotiated, one where love does not require self-betrayal, one where boundaries are not a lack of compassion, but an expression of wisdom. God has placed distance not to harden your heart, but to heal it. Trust that what was removed has been handled with purpose. Trust that what you lost has not been wasted. And trust that the same God who took you out of harm's reach is leading you into a life where you no longer have to disappear in order to be at peace.